Bonjour, bon Saint-David, et welcome to French A-Level First Session. I'm Madame Lloyd, and I will be facilitating the session and answering your questions in the background in the Q&A. Madame Griffiths will be presenting. Today, she will be talking about the translation. Now, I'll hand you over to Madame Griffiths. Bonne écoute.
Merci. Bonjour. Welcome to today's first session. And during today's first session, we're going to be talking about the A-level translation. The aims of the session today are as follows. I'm going to be talking to you about using a checklist for use during the translation and how to recognize verbs and grammatical points within a translation. So we will start with using a checklist. So why is it a good idea to use a checklist as you attack the translation at A-level? This will give you a structure to follow as you complete your translation. Le succès en 10 étapes. So here are the 10 points which will help you go through the checklist for your translation. Number 1, read through the passage to be translated carefully to get an overview of the passage. Remember not to start translating at this stage. Number 2, read through the passage again. This time, highlight words and phrases you know in one colour and unfamiliar ones or ones which might cause difficulty in another colour. Number 3, now read through the passage again and look at the verb tenses, adjectives, connectives, adverbs, etc. and underline these. Number 4, you are now ready to start your translation, one sentence at a time. If you do not know a particular word or phrase, think of a synonym. So that is a word with the same meaning instead of leaving a gap. Number 5, correct each sentence as you go along. Don't move on to the next sentence until you have done this. Number 6, read your translated sentence once again to make sure it makes sense and sounds French. Number 7, look back at the actual English passage. Check that you haven't omitted anything. Check each sentence carefully to make sure every word has been included. Number 8, at the end, when you've completed your translation, leave some time to look over it again. This time, use the acronym STAIRCASE to help you look over your translation. I will go through the meaning of the actual acronym STAIRCASE later on. Number 9, check you have crossed out your rough draft if you made one. And number 10, make sure your handwriting is legible. Bonne chance. Now, we are going to look at an example of a translation, an A-level translation, a WJC A-level translation from summer 2015. Now, as you know, the translation is about 100 words in length. This translation here is exactly 100 words. The translation will be split into 4 equal parts. I would like you to take a minute now, please, to read through the translation which you see on your screen. We will now look at the translation in greater depth. In a moment, on your screen, you will see the first part of the translation. What I would like you to do is when you see the translation is to take a minute or two and look for any tenses and any grammar points. So this is what you should be doing with each part of your translation. Before you actually translate, you need to spend the time using the checklist and looking at tenses to make sure that you translate the tenses correctly and to see if there are any specific grammar points which need to be looked at as you translate each sentence, so each short paragraph. I would like you to take a minute now, please, to have a think about this. Please write your answers in the Q&A. So which tenses can you see here? And are there any grammar points to remember? Remember to think tenses and grammar points. Madam Lloyd will answer anything, any queries or any questions which you have in the chat, which is the Q&A, remember. Now, let's have a look at this in a little bit more depth. So on the screen in front of you now, you will see that I have highlighted, okay, certain things, and then I've underlined certain things as well. So if we look at them together, if we start at the top, so I've highlighted about 60. And in French, this would be soixantaine. So what you need to remember when you're translating a number with about in front of it, that you add the ending N to the number. Sometimes with soixante, you'd actually drop the E as well. As we go across through the first sentence, we have 20 of whom, and you have the translation at the top, dont, okay? And then I've underlined the present tense, are. Underneath then, you will see I've highlighted hunger strike. Okay, so that would be turned around when you translate it. And then I've underlined have been occupying. Now this is the present tense. But if we skim and go towards the end of the sentence, we will see the French word since, depuis. Now in English, we have been occupying. Now when we're using the depuis construction in French, we need to use the present tense. So you would use the present tense with depuis to translate have been occupying. We're now going to move on to the second part of the translation. And again, on your screen, 2 questions for you to think about in a moment. Which tenses can you see here? Are there any grammar points to remember? So I'd like you again to use the Q&A now, please, to note any tenses. Okay, try and use the name of the tense. You can answer obviously in French or English, and then any grammar points. And Madam Lloyd will be available to go through to answer your questions. You should have had a chance to note now and the tenses or grammar points you can see in this sentence. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and we'll have a look at them together. So you'll be able to see here, if we start at the top of a sentence, okay, they have asked, I've underlined, and I've made a note that this is the passé composé or the perfect tense. And as we go through, we have to translate to England. So en français, en Angleterre, so using en plus the feminine country. And remember that the majority of French countries which end in E are feminine. Okay. And then we have, present tense. And in the same part of the sentence here, I've highlighted they, and we translate they as tous. And then as we go further down, so that they can ask, so in order to ask, you could use pour and the infinitive. And then right at the end of the sentence, we need to translate they. Now then, we need to remember that they is ich, but where does this go? So you will have to remember and think where this would go, because this would not be standalone at the end of the sentence. So these are the main grammar points and tenses which you should have picked out within this part of the translation. So as you can see, if you spend the time in your preparation by doing this, when we come to do the translation sentence or part at a time, you will remember what you have to bear in mind. I'm now going to move to the next part of the translation. So again, we're using the same two questions. Which tenses can you see here? And are there any grammar points to remember? So in this section, we actually have two sentences and we have some speech as well. So again, use the Q&A please to have a think and note down whether you can see tenses or grammar points, and Madam Lloyd will help you. few more seconds just for you to have a look to see which tenses and grammar points you can pick out before we go through it together. So I'm going to move on now to the next slide so we can actually look at this together. So we're going to start, okay, the first part of the sentence, the Syrians do not agree. So I've underlined do not agree, and I've made a note it's the present tense, and that we need to remember to use a negative. Moving along through the sentence, I've underlined the prefix suggestion. Now we need to remember in French that apostrophe S doesn't exist and that you need to turn this around and it would be translated as the suggestion of the prefect. Moving along, they seek, present tense. And then as we move to the second line, again, we have the same grammatical point coming up, en France. And as we move along again, you cannot imagine. So I've made a note of present plus negative. Okay, but when you actually translate this little bit here, you don't actually have to translate cannot. You could just say, okay, you can't just use imagine. So you could just use you imagine, you don't imagine. Okay, as well, that is fine. And for using you, remember you could use vous, you could use tu, and you could also use on as a collective. Moving along, we have what, and this would be translated as ce que. And then as we move along again, we have suffered, passé composé, or perfect. And then I've highlighted in Calais. Now we need to remember that we wouldn't say en Calais. We would use a plus a town or the name of a village. As you remember, you have an accent. And then as we move towards the end of the paragraph, said, passé composé again. So these are the main tenses and grammatical points which you should have picked out here. Now, moving on, okay, to the last part. Again, which tenses can you see here? Are there any grammar points to remember? 2 sentences in this section. And again, please use your Q&A to note any tenses or grammar points. And Madam Lloyd is available to help you. And I'll give you another moment to have a look at these. So just remember tenses and grammar points. "30 seconds. And moving on, this is what you should have pointed out. So if we remember, tenses and grammar points. So we start at the first sentence and I've underlined left. So again, I've made a note that this is the passé composé. I've highlighted to save. We would use pour and the infinitive. So in order to save. And then I've underlined explained. Again, passé composé or perfect. But what we need to remember here is because we have speech and we're using the third person singular with il, we're going to invert, so turn around the subject, and then we need to remember to add a T between the il and the a. So it would be a-t-il expliqué. And then as we move through to the second sentence, I've underlined waiting for as the verb, present tense. Now I've made a note here that the verb to wait for is attendre. Now the actual for I've highlighted because this isn't a depuis construction. Okay, you don't need to use pour. The actual part of for is included in the French verb attendre. So that is something you need to bear in mind. So if we have a think again now, we've been through the 4 parts of the translation. So what you would do now, you would actually start and translate your sentence, your translation, okay, one sentence or one part at a time. And after you've completed each section or each individual section sentence, you would look through the checklist and make sure and follow everything which I explained in the checklist earlier. So if we just go back, just to have a quick look again at the checklist. Okay, so remember we've highlighted the words and phrases. Okay, we've looked at the verb tenses, etc. We've looked at each part. We've done our underlining, etc. Okay, we've done that, and then I'm now going to show you the acronym which I suggest which you use for using at the end to look at and check your work. So we start with S. Are the spellings correct? T. Are the tenses correct? Make sure you have used the correct tense. That is why it's a good idea to make a note of the tense. Are your accents going the correct way? Have you omitted an accent, for example? It's very important that you check accents. Intensifiers, for example, very, okay, to, T-O-O, okay. Register, have you used the correct register? Is it a formal piece or is it informal? So should you be using tu or vous or, okay. Connectives, have you used your connectives correctly? Do you have the correct connectives? Have you ensured that your adjectives agree with the subject? Is the subjunctive needed? Okay, that is very important to make sure. And as well, do you have the correct verb endings? So the acronym staircase is very useful for at the end of the translation for you to go through it one more time. On this slide, you will see the correct version of the translation. Now you will see within the translation itself that there are more than one way, okay, there's more than one way of translating certain parts. So this is why you have the forward slashes, and then there's certain things which would not be accepted. So for example, mercredi, okay, without the R would not be accepted. So you will be able to, in your own time now, you'll be able to go through this and perhaps have a go at the actual translation itself and then correct it by looking at the slide here. We're coming towards the end of our session this evening, So if you have any questions, now is the time, please, or you have any queries, now is the time to put them into the Q&A and Madam Lloyd will answer your questions. So before we end the session this evening, I will give you a few moments to put any questions or any comments you have in the chat and Madam Lloyd will ask you. Okay, she'll be able to answer them for you.
Merci Madame Griffiths pour la présentation.
Merci.
Next week we'll talk about the essay question.
Yes.
So if you have any question, please ask now, and otherwise, à la semaine prochaine.